Thank you, Johanna, for telling the untold story of Punjabi settlers in Oregon, their silence history, and how Punjabis parallel those of in BC for cheap labor from the use 'em and lose 'em attitude. Next, we'll move on to Dr. Paul Englesberg, is a professor of education at Walden University, specializing in adult and higher education and educational research. Previously, he was on the faculty at Western Washington University, where he initiated the Asian American Curriculum and Research Project. He has also taught in several universities in Taiwan and China. He's conducted research on the Asian Americans in the Pacific Northwest of the US, focusing especially on the 1907 riots and expulsion of the majority of Sikh population from Bellingham and Everett in Washington state. Dr. Paul Englesberg will be speaking of the 1907 Bellingham riot and the anti-Asian hostilities in the Pacific Northwest.
I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and very pleased to be on this panel. In some ways, chronologically, my talk maybe should have preceded Johanna's, because I'm going to go back to 1906, 1907, and perhaps trace what happened to maybe some people who ended up in Oregon, and some ended up in California, some came back to Canada, some went back to India. We don't really know. There are maybe so many hundreds of thousands of Inder Singhs. I'm wondering whether the Inder Singh who was in the newspapers in Bellingham was the same Inder Singh who was on the video that we saw, who was hanged, or an Inder Singh who was in Astoria. It's hard to know, to trace which Inder Singh or whatever, and that's something that I hope some people hear. One of my hopes in giving talks to audiences like this is maybe some people can connect the dots, and I'm going to be showing some photographs, and maybe someone will figure out that, gee, that person who was expelled from Bellingham, maybe that's the same person 20 years later who shows up in Victoria or Sacramento or back in Punjab or on the list of martyrs. It's hard to know. So my talk today is not really directly pertaining to Gadar, and I'm probably the only speaker on this roster today who isn't really talking directly about Gadar. But I'm aware that, and a lot of speakers today have already alluded to this, that the environment and the feelings of being excluded in Canada and the US, being driven out, and the British government, India not really caring, not really protecting people, that contributed to the sentiments that led to some of the revolutionary feelings. But I'm going to be talking about more the economic and the racial environment in Washington state, kind of in contrast to some of the things that that Johanna was talking about in Astoria, behind the scenes that may have fed into Gadar, but I'm really talking about more of the story, not from the perspective of the Punjabis themselves, because unfortunately we have very little record of it, even less than there is in Oregon, but really the story more about the majority population, the government in Bellingham and the workers, the labor, the police, the Christian ministers, arrest records, all the sources that we have that talk about the quote-unquote Hindus in general. Very seldom do they even name any names or talk to any people directly. So unfortunately, it's a story that I'm going to be telling that leaves out the most important people from the story, because we just don't have much record of the actual 250 or so laborers from Punjab who were working in the mills at the time. And I guess I want to say, just following up from the previous talk and the birth of Gadar in Astoria, you know, one thing, I think Hugh Johnston said this once before we were on a panel about the work of a historian, but you know, historians have to rely on the evidence, and we can sort of wonder what would have happened if. So, you know, it makes me think, if there hadn't been the expulsion of the Punjabis from Bellingham, who knows, maybe Bellingham would have been the birthplace of the Gadar movement. Who knows? Historians can't answer those questions, but I hadn't thought of that. But that's sort of maybe one of the untold paths, untold stories of history. What would have happened if? Just like what would have happened if they had been expelled from Astoria. One never knows that. Let's see. So I also have a map here. I don't know if anyone can see this, but Bellingham is just south of the border. I'm sure just about everyone has been through there. And the story I'm going to tell is mostly around Bellingham, but I'll also mention a couple other places. Do I have a pointer here? I don't know if you can see this, but there's the Olympic Peninsula here, and Aberdeen here, and Grays Harbor was another mill area, and Everett just north of Seattle. So there were substantial Punjabi populations in these mill areas, in Bellingham, in Everett, and in Aberdeen. And in all three cases, the Punjabis left, either driven out or they were afraid of being driven out, and they left. And Blaine, which has come up for those of you who don't drive back and forth to the US. I know some people are here from California. Blaine is the border town just south, north of Bellingham, so that's the point of entry. It didn't have mills, so most of the mills were around Bellingham. So I think most people here are familiar with the basics of what happened on September 4th and 5th of 1907. A lot of these pictures have been reproduced elsewhere from the newspapers. And I'm not going to dwell on all the details. I want to talk about some of the underlying issues and causes. So why is this important? The forced mass expulsions of Punjabi immigrants by mobs in Bellingham and Everett, Washington in 1907 stand out as some of the earliest challenges that Sikhs faced in North America. Although these events have received far less attention than the more violent and more politically charged Kamagado Maru struggle and Gadar activism, the 1907 riots were significant in influencing the immigration debates and policies in Canada and the US, and in serving as a prelude to an extended period of struggle by Sikhs and other South Asians in North America, including farm workers and Gadar militants. Historians have emphasized various factors and aspects of the 1907 attacks, including labor strife, racial supremacist ideology, fears due to sociocultural differences, reaction to nationalism and radicalism, and the efforts of the Exclusion League. More recently, historians have paid particular attention to the legal and political implications and the results on a national level on both sides of the US-Canada border. My study of Asian immigration in the Northwest region, and Bellingham in particular, has concluded that there was a concerted effort to harass Punjabis and arouse popular animosity that began a full year before the 1907 riot. And I hadn't even looked at this. I almost came across it by accident in some newspapers in September 1906, because I started looking at 1907 and the aftermath, and it was only a couple of years later that I started going back and seeing what were the first mentions of Hindus in the Bellingham press. And so I'll show you some of that. Considering the focus, I'm sorry. So in my paper, rather than focusing on Gadar, I'm focusing on the local and historical context going back to the first arrivals in Washington state and the reactions of the community, And then secondly, how the riot and other attacks, like in Everett, were portrayed in the press, and how various individuals and groups responded at the local level, mostly in Bellingham. And I'm going to conclude, as Johanna did in the previous talk, with what's going on now. And there's some interesting parallels. 1907 was the action in Bellingham. 2007, which is when I got interested in doing this research, we held a 100th year centennial commemoration, and we also have in 2007 a proclamation similar to the one that Astoria has just recently passed. So I'm going to end up talking about how we responded in the Bellingham area. There is a Gurdwara in Linden, which is in the county where Bellingham is, Whatcom County, and there's now a Sikh community of about 500 families or so. But they don't trace their roots directly to those who were expelled. This is kind of a second wave. So just some background on Bellingham. And I'm not going to really, I'll get back to these drawings, but just these appeared, and it took me a couple of years to figure out how this happened. How was it on the day of the riot that they had a professional artist depiction of a Sikh and some fanciful imagined, I don't know if you can see here, but there's a turban Sikh playing some sort of an oboe-like instrument, charming a cobra, sort of the white fantasies of these exotic, strange people from India, but a pretty realistic portrait of a Sikh. And it was only a couple of years later, when I went back to 1906, that I found that they dredged something up from their newspaper records for this. So there were some photographs and a lot of coverage in the local press. And I was able to reconstruct some better photographs. The ones in the newspapers, you could hardly see people's faces. But fortunately, Collier's magazine, which was a very prominent mass circulation national magazine in the US, they had a reporter who was going up and down the Pacific coast, especially in California, writing about the Japanese immigration when the riot broke out. So he came up to Bellingham a week or two after the riot and to report on it. And Collier's got hold of some of the same negatives, I guess, that the Bellingham newspapers had used, and because they had a glossy format, their photographs were a lot easier to blow up and reproduce. But I wanted to just point out something that doesn't come up in any of the actual text coverage that we can see from this photo, that, you know, one wonders, what were these Punjabis, and as has been mentioned in the previous panel, 85 to 90% we think were Sikhs, judging from the ship's records and their names and all. But when you look at the faces of these men, and they're all hiding here, they're, after the riot, the police had all put them, for their own protection, of course, as was the rhetoric, in the sort of jail basement below the city hall in Bellingham. So they spent the night there, and this is one of the only surviving photographs of that. But I don't know how well you can see in the back, but roughly half of them, maybe less than half, seem to be wearing turbans and have beards, and maybe more than half are wearing kind of American-style hats, and they have mustaches but no beard. And so they've kind of adapted maybe to mill life, where perhaps long hair and a beard might be dangerous when you're working in the mills, but it shows something of the lifestyle, that some are turbaned and some are not. And they all seem fairly young. From the ship's records, when they came into Victoria and Vancouver, they record dates. A lot of them were in their mid, sometimes late 20s, so they weren't teenagers, but just to show you how I found this, because it's kind of interesting. This was a montage of photographs in Collier's that at first I stumbled upon this also because when you do a search, the title of this magazine article was about the Japanese on the Pacific coast, but in the midst of this these photos of the Japanese, they have these two photos from Bellingham. So the one at the top that I blew up, you can see, and the one at the bottom here is showing the city hall where they were incarcerated or kept overnight, and then they're outside trying to figure out what to do in this picture. And these are just some blow-ups, so you can maybe see in the back some of these photographs of the Bellingham Punjabis. You'll see some in turban and some in hats, some shaved, some with beards. We don't know their names. I've compiled maybe names of 30 or so from arrest records in various places. And I won't go into detail about this, but Johanna mentioned the legacy of the Chinese expulsion up and down the Pacific coast that happened in 1885 and 86. Bellingham was not immune from this. Bellingham had a small Chinese population that was driven out mostly by economic threat and boycott. They prided themselves of not having to use violence the way Tacoma did in driving out violently 700 Chinese. But interestingly enough, one of the Bellingham newspapers drew the connection very clearly between the two movements, the anti-Chinese movement. I didn't put these together. I want to make clear this is not my photoshopping. This appeared in 1907, where they're making the connection between 1885, the Chinese being driven out, and 1907. They didn't call it ethnic cleansing. I don't think that term had been invented yet, but basically that's what they're showing, with sort of a mixture. And previous speaker talked about this mixture of the Oregon press, the Oregonian. The same mixture appears in the Bellingham press. On one hand, they don't think violence and vigilante action is a good idea. They criticize it. On the other hand, they're kind of happy to see another non-white group of laborers go. So they kind of applaud the end result, which is white Bellingham, just like white Canada or BC. But on the other hand, they deplore the means of, forced expulsion, because it's seen they don't, and one of the reasons is political and economic. Bellingham is a frontier town. They want to attract white immigrants, white businesses. They don't want to be seen as a home of vigilante justice. They want to be seen as a place that the railroad should connect. There was this struggle between different Pacific Coast cities of where the railroad would go, because wherever the railroad goes, you're going to have economic development, and where people would go and where businesses would situate themselves. So they didn't want to have this Tacoma kind of tag of, oh, Bellingham is this place where people don't follow the government or the police just support riots. But in fact, that is what Bellingham became known for. And Punjabis, when they would cross the border after the riot, they would stay clear of Bellingham. They were told, don't get off the train in Bellingham. And that's perhaps lends some credence to the previous speaker's argument that perhaps the population in Oregon was bolstered because people were avoiding Washington State even after the riots. They didn't quite trust that they would be safe, even though there might be jobs to be had. On the other hand, one could make an economic argument that after the riots, the mills were loath to hire Punjabis out of fear that this wouldn't be accepted and they might get in trouble for hiring them. There was a lot of pressure put on them. So what happened, for those of you who aren't familiar with the details, I'll just give a little thumbnail sketch here. The evening of September 4th, 1907, a mob attacked and drove out over 200 immigrant laborers from India, who they commonly referred to as Hindus. The goal of the rioters was to force the workers from the mills in the city. They used beatings and the threat of force to round up the men from their beds and from the mills. By the end of the evening, over 100 had been herded into the city jail that I showed you, the basement of the city hall, and they, based on an agreement, worked out with the police chief that if they didn't hurt anybody, the police would keep them there, and then the next morning they could be put on trains and would leave the city. That was kind of the deal that was made. And they rounded up more the next morning. Within a few days, the goals of the mob were fulfilled. All of the South Asian mill workers had either left by train, by steamship, for points south, Oregon and California, or they had left on foot, walking back along the railroad tracks. Those who didn't want to spend the money or didn't have any money, they walked back across the border to Canada. We don't know how many did that, but there's evidence that quite a few did that also. Several of the South Asian workers were beaten, according to spokesmen for the group. Many took the threat seriously and were afraid for their lives. There was the beginning of wire service in 1907. So some of you may have seen the New York Times article, and a bunch of other newspapers across the country claimed that Sikhs were hospitalized. The local press denied that, and there was a lot of discussion about who actually fed the New York Times in this wire service things, because it sounded a lot more serious when you read the out-of-town papers than the Bellingham papers. It's another question for historians. It's hard to answer. But we know there were some beatings. The local papers downplayed the injuries, and these wire services made it sound really terrible. Nobody was killed. There were no martyrs in this. So compared to all the Gadar sacrifices, you know, one might say, well, why is Bellingham even that important? Nobody really died. Some people went on to live very long, productive lives in California and did very fine leaving Bellingham. So what's the big deal? Well, it was the largest expulsion that I think has happened in the United States except for the Chinese, you know, one of the largest bits of ethnic cleansing. Fortunately, it was done without anyone getting badly hurt, with nobody getting killed. So one could say that the Bellingham police were the heroes here. They stopped anyone from getting killed, you know. It's hard, again, to say what might have happened if. But this was not the only attack. There were subsequent attacks, and I'll mention that later. I want to speak a little bit about what happened before this and what led to this. First, there's a lot of speculation in many history books that the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League, which later got renamed as the Asian Exclusion League, it was based in San Francisco, had an office in Seattle, and there are suggestions that the Bellingham riot was really brought about due to their activities, partly because one of their local leaders, the Seattle Exclusion League secretary, Mr. Fowler, came to the area, and then he came from Bellingham, he went to Vancouver, and the riot broke out in Vancouver. So the juxtaposition kind of led to speculation that they really instigated it. But it seems to have, the riot in Bellingham seems to have caught Fowler by surprise, and his organization and the president of the Vancouver, Canada branch had been planning a mass demonstration for September 7th in Vancouver, BC, with delegates from all points on the Pacific coast. And it seemed like they were busy preparing this Vancouver meeting September 7th. So I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to flip through, and this is another picture from the newspaper showing the mill workers going back to collect their wages before they leave Bellingham. Another picture of the same. And this shows some of the Punjabis waiting at the train station for the train that's going to take them maybe to California or Oregon, point south. This one, we're not sure if it's in Bellingham or not. but it depicts three Sikhs in front of a restaurant. If anyone knows where the OK Dining Room was in 1907 or 8, please let me know. I don't know if it was in Vancouver or Victoria, somewhere in the Northwest. And this is a posed studio photograph, the only one we have of three Sikh gentlemen. I guess they were mill workers, but they dressed up for this picture, maybe for marriage or whatever, in Bellingham. I wanted to just talk a little bit about the very first Punjabis that at least were mentioned of crossing the border, and these were turned over to the immigration authorities. These two men, or it was actually one man with two depictions, Allah Singh as they thought his name, and they didn't know whether they were from India or from Afghanistan. It was totally exotic when they described. There wasn't this fear when they first came. It was like, who are these strange people with strange names? And they couldn't get their names right. This one, they called them Allah Bing Bing. They sort of made fun of them. But I mentioned a year before the riot, I found that there was the beginning of this antagonism. They went from being these exotic kind of curiosities to maybe it's a threat. And a full-page article appeared in a 1906 paper, September 1906, called "Have We a Dusky Peril?" And the word dusky is really important here because there was a real stress on skin tone, because again, this was whites fearing browns. And dusky meant you weren't white. You weren't black, maybe. Some newspapers called the Punjabis black. Most of them called them brown or dusky. And they're talking about Hindu hordes invading the state with a big question mark. And this is where the drawings came from. And it's a mixture of fear-mongering and, well, these are interesting people. They're peaceful people, but there are hundreds of thousands of them waiting to come. And what if they all come to Bellingham? Then we're in trouble. I'll just show you some blow-ups of these pictures. I don't have time to go into details, but we do have some names from arrest records, and whoops, what did I do? And I just wanted to mention that part of the policy, besides the newspapers, the police and the judges seem to have been part of this attempt to make life miserable for the Punjabis and maybe make them go somewhere else and not stay in Bellingham. They seem to have a selective arrest policy of what we would call ethnic profiling these days. If you had a turban, you would get arrested for drunkenness. I mean, the popular thing that you got arrested for in Bellingham was drunkenness. How much these guys were drinking, I don't know, but they were getting arrested. If you were white and you got arrested for drunkenness, you got released the next day per orders of the police chief. This is written in the arrest records. If you were Negro, you got fired out of town, which meant you got taken to the outskirts of town and told, don't ever come back to Bellingham. If you were a Hindu, you got fined about from 1 to 2 weeks' wages if you wanted to get out of jail. So they were kind of making life really not worth staying in Bellingham because you would be impoverished. They were trying to drive them out. And they began to call them in the newspapers, you know, all kinds of undesirable names. There was this real campaign, it seemed, to turn the curiosities into people that we don't want in the community. And there were some petitions being circulated in the mills by workers. So there's evidence that there was this growing animosity, perhaps fed by the newspapers, but not necessarily by the Exclusion League, that happened a full year before the riot. So I don't have time for a whole lot more. I want to just jump to 2007 and get away from the history, although there's a lot more that could be said. Sorry, I don't have a way of jumping. This, by the way, is Tuli Singh Joel, who many of you may know his history. He lived till he was 99 and a half and was a farmer in Yuba City. I interviewed his two sons. I just wanted to mention that his sons told me that he was a farmer. He wasn't a Gadarite, but he gave sort of refuge and monetary support to some of these Berkeley students who were very important in Gadar. So that's one actual Bellingham connection I know. He's someone who left Bellingham, was driven out, became a successful farmer and community member, and did support. And I think there's, from his example, there's evidence that, you know, just apolitical or semi-political farmers like him were probably in support. And when he went back to his wife in Punjab, he was put under house arrest for 12 or 14 years because he was a suspect, just because he had been in America, of being a Gadar sympathizer. That's his son. So I want to just move forward here to what we did in 2007. We, when I say we, myself and a friend who were doing this research and sort of community building, got together with the Sikh community, and we contacted the mayor and the county, and we got a recognition of what had happened, and they signed a joint proclamation, these civic officials, of calling it a day of healing and reconciliation for the 100th anniversary. And we had some scholarly talks. I produced some posters to educate the public and put them in the university and the public library. We did several events to educate people, because just like Johanna was saying, people don't know about this. They think civil rights is Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, and Selma, Alabama. They don't realize civil rights happened all the time against the Chinese and Punjabis, etc. And we had a big gathering at the temple in Linden, just north of Bellingham. And it was really a community building event, so we tried to turn something that had been divisive and whites against browns into bringing people together. And the Bellingham Herald, which has the same name, the same press that had been so intolerant 100 years ago, they published an apology, and a very strong apology. We didn't ask them for this apology. They did this on their own. They say, "We apologize to the East Indian people in our community today, and to any right-thinking person who is disgusted by the actions this newspaper took in one of the darkest times in our community's history. We are disgusted too." And I'll be around all day. I brought along with me some examples of the 2007 newspapers that did really great coverage. I shared my research with them, and they interviewed some other people, but they did a great job in educating people about what happened, making some meaning of it. So I brought these along, and I just wanted to sort of say something about the gathering today and urge all of you. I see a lot of empty seats here, and maybe what we need to do, you know, we're interested in history, not everyone's interested in history, but I think it's important for us to reach out to other Sikhs and non-Sikhs alike, to bring them to events like this, because people don't know about this history. It's not just part of Sikh history, it's part of American history. It's not in the books, and if we're going to get people to think about it, to understand it, we have to bring them here. And maybe to bring them here, we have to have a big name to bring them, or maybe we just have to do a better job with publicity. But I think it's really important that we fill up the seats and we get this story told, not just for the next generation young Sikhs, but for Americans, especially here in BC and in Washington and Oregon and California, because it's part of our history. Thank you.